ASUS recently contacted me over mail because they are celebrating the 30-year anniversary of ASUS, which is a very long time, and they asked me to do a video about my favorite ASUS product and also the one I have the most emotions to, or I attach the most interesting story to. And my choice is the Rampage Extreme, and we're talking about the very first Rampage Extreme chipset, X48 socket 775. So welcome to a new episode of the Hardware Legends video series. And on my table you can already see the Rampage Extreme, which is my favorite board when it comes to extreme overclocking. I don't know how many hours or days and weeks I spent overclocking with this board. Not this board in particular, because I think I owned 6 or 7 Rampage Extremes in total, mainly because there was a fluctuation in frontside bus quality. So some of them would clock higher, some of them would clock lower in frontside bus. Back in the days we actually had to pre-select boards, not only CPUs, we also had to pre-bin boards. But that's the one that's in my best condition, that's one I kept for collecting, and it has pretty much perfect condition, it's almost unused. And this is the board we will take a look at closer today. In comparison to a nowadays mainboard, socket 775 mainboard is a lot different. Starting from P55, Intel introduced the PCH, the Platform Controller Hub. So that's what we know nowadays as chipset. For example, C170, Z390, all of them are platform controller hubs. Back in the days we actually had an ICH and an MCH. So memory controller hub and I/O controller hub. Memory controller hub is the piece on here, which is in the north of the mainboard, and that's why it was called Northbridge. That's also known as the chipset, so the X48 is the memory controller hub. On the bottom, on the south bridge, we have the ICH, the I/O controller hub, and this is the ICH9R, if I remember correctly, was manufactured in 130 nanometer size, and the I/O controller hub was mainly for I/O, as you can imagine, so that's for SATA, for audio, for network, all of the things that transfer data. That's what the south bridge is for. The north bridge is basically the connection between the CPU, the memory slots, and the PCI Express slots. And the north bridge is also connected to the CPU over the FSB, the frontside bus, which is probably the most important thing on those platforms. So the FSB controls basically everything. On here we have a Q6600, a quad-to-quad, basically the first real quad core from Intel, and the core-to-quad is connected to the north bridge over the FSB, and in this case the FSB would run at a speed of 266 MHz, and in combination with the CPU multiplier of 9, which is the stock multiplier of the Q6600, it would result in a CPU clock of 2400 MHz. But if we just adjust the FSB clock, we can already overclock the CPU, so push it to 300, to 400, whatever, you can directly increase the speed of the CPU, and that's what we loved so much about those platforms back in the days, because no matter which CPU you put in there, no matter if it was a fixed multiplier or an unlocked multiplier, you could always overclock your CPU. So any CPU on this socket was always overclockable, which was really, really nice. So you could just get the cheapest CPU and increase the performance. As I said before, the north bridge is connecting the CPU and also the PCI Express slots, and on here we have 2x16 PCI Express 2.0, which would make you think that you can run SLI and Crossfire, but back in the days it was not possible, because I think it was mainly a license thing that you could not run SLI, you could only run Crossfire on those boards, because back then Nvidia was still making chipsets for mainboards, and you had the Enforce chipsets, which would allow you to run SLI. But later on, I think in 2009 or 2010, somebody came up with the Hyper SLI, which was basically a software hack for those motherboards, and you could run SLI even on the X48 chipset or X38, P45, and all of those, you could run SLI with Hyper SLI. What I loved the most about the Rampage Extreme was the heatsink design. So if we just take a closer look at this whole construct here, we have one massive piece, which is basically one heatsink for the top VRMs, one heatsink for the VRMs on the side. Then we have this big heatsink with a water block attached. We have the north bridge underneath, and then a heat pipe going to the south bridge. What I love really about this is the modular design. So we can basically just use a screwdriver and remove this small water block. And I would actually love that mainboard manufacturers would kind of go back to this design and make it a little bit more modular, because as you can see, you could just remove this piece. It was just a very simple and solid design for a water block. It has not really structure inside, but it was enough to keep the North Bridge cold, because it was, if I remember correctly, manufactured in 130 nanometer size, and therefore the heat output, especially at like 1.45 volt, was really quite a lot. So that's why we really needed this kind of heatsink design. In the accessories, we had additional cooling elements, which is really cool. So as you can see, most of the stuff here is unused. As I said, this is one of my collectible mainboards, which I didn't really use for almost 10 years. And we have an additional heatsink on here, which we could attach to this place instead of using the water cooler. So if you would not use water cooling loop, you could just attach this for additional heatsink surface. And if this was not enough, you could even attach this small fan to this heatsink. They were not really nice because they were a little bit loud, so nobody was really using them, but at least you had the option to directly improve your cooling performance. Same goes to the VRM heatsink on here. So if your VRM temperature was too high and you did not want to use water cooling or whatever, you could remove this piece, replace it with this additional heatsink, and even increase your heatsink surface more. So that was really cool, just the modular options you had on this board for increasing the cooling surface or whatever using water cooling. You could even remove this completely if you didn't like it. If you would just use water cooling on here, the heat sinks or the heat pipes on here would allow cooling, so you can remove this entirely and just rely on water cooling. That would also work. Then you had those on here, which is kind of funny. So that's additional water cooling gear for attaching the block to your loop with adapters and stuff. They were not really pretty, but it worked. Then we also had an I/O shield that was already illuminated back then. So we had a small cable you had to attach to a connector on the top here, and then it would light up. So even 10 years ago, we already had kind of RGB. It was just not, you could just not change the color. But accessory-wise, this board was really far ahead. We even had this small sound card on there, which was using PCI Express ×1. So you could use this in addition. Just plug it in here. That was already included inside the main board. And one of my absolute features is the LCD poster. It's such a small feature, but that's one of my absolute favorite features of this board. So you could attach this LCD poster with this cable to the board, and then you have a small area on the bottom here where you can control it, but I will show you how this works once everything is set up. In Windows, it's extremely helpful to use the software setFSB, which is to set your FSB. And if we just take a look at the software, the first thing you have to do is to select your clock generator. So you can see in this case we have the ICS 9L blah blah blah. So that's the clock generator of my FSB. Then you click on Get FSB, and then you have the selection on here where you basically click on those arrows. And then, for example, I can adjust it from 405 to 400. Click Set FSB, and then can see FSB was adjusted to 400. So this way you can use software to adjust the clock in the OS. But then we also have this very neat tool. It's the LCD poster. It's one of my absolute favorite features of this board. And we have those buttons on here. So we basically have back, enter, left and right, and reset and start. Those are not necessary for the LCD poster, but those are to navigate on the LCD poster. My LCD poster is a little bit broken because it's a little bit old, but if I look really from the top, I can kind of still see it. As you can see, I can just navigate on here. So we can, for example, go to Dynamic OC, DIN OC, enter, and then we already can adjust the FSB to 400, for example. And also there is just monitoring data. So if we go back, go to hardware info, then we can just take a look at the temperature, for example, and take a look at CPU temperature. You cannot really see it. I can see it that it now shows 47 degrees Celsius. Not sure if it's visible on the camera, but that's one of my absolute favorite features of this board, because back in the days when we were doing extreme overclocking, we could just dynamically adjust the clocks during the benchmark. The system is assembled. Obviously we're using the Rampage Extreme and also the Q6600. We have 4 memory sticks with 4 GB each, Corsair Vengeance with Samsung ICs, very rare memory modules, also really good back then in those days. We have a 2080 Ti Strix and everything is water cooled, or the CPU is water cooled. And I'm already in BIOS and I want to show you some things. So stock FSB of this CPU and this board is 266, and the highest CPU multiplier we can use is 9. So in combination of the FSB and the multiplier, we have a resulting CPU speed of 2400 MHz. Typically, if we would OC the system, we would just adjust the FSB speed to, for example, 360, which would result in about 3.3 GHz on the CPU. But now you can see memory speed is 1443 MHz, and we cannot go higher because that's the highest memory multiplier that's available. And that was an issue back then because we had to use higher FSB speeds to increase memory speed. So in this case we would rather go for 405 and lower the CPU ratio to 8, so we still have 3.3 GHz on the CPU, but we have a higher memory speed of 1600. Obviously you can continue with this game, so you can always lower your CPU multiplier and try to increase the FSB to just get higher memory performance. Also, what we have to do is adjust CPU voltage to 1.45. Sounds much, but it's a 65 nanometer CPU, so it can really take a lot of voltage. FSB is 1.43 volts, and that's the voltage for the FSB, obviously, because we have to increase this to make sure that we can run high FSB speeds of 400 and above. And North Bridge voltage we also have to increase for higher FSB, and in this case we're using 1.45 volt. As you can see, we are in Windows, and I already performed a Cinebench R20 run because it simply takes ages. With older generation hardware like this, with the Q6600, it just takes forever. The R20, the multi is kind of fine, it's 694 points. If we compare that in the list, for example, a 7700K has 2400 points, so it's like 4 times faster than the Q6600. If we check the single core performance, we can see single core performance is 180 points. And if we just compare that in the list, we can see, for example, a 6700HQ, which is a mobile CPU, has already doubled the performance with 359 points, and on top 7700K 467 points. So yeah, the Q6600 is a lot slower. So let's go over and simply try to play some PUBG. My original plan was to play around Far Cry 5 with you guys, so I can compare the performance numbers of this CPU with a nowadays CPU, but then I figured out that Far Cry 5 is not playable with this old CPU because it requires SSE 4.1, and the Q6600 doesn't have that, and you need an emulator for that. I tried that, you have to disable anti-cheat and all of that. Takes a lot of time. It's kind of possible, it seems. I found some instructions online how to do it, but it would just take too much time, so I decided to just play around PUBG. And I'm just playing live now, basically running around the island of the third map. And on the top left corner you can see the FPS monitor, which is also the software I'm using to visualize the data on here. So looking at the FPS, it looks good. We can see like 80-90 FPS, but it doesn't feel as smooth. That's the typical problem we have with FPS and the average FPS and minimum FPS. That's why most of the people nowadays are using the 99th percentile for measurement. And if we look at the 1% low, or the 0.1% low, we're looking at 34 and 25, which is a lot worse, and that's also how it kind of feels like. So it's playable, don't get me wrong. So we can play PUBG with the Q6600 once it's overclocked. Using its stock with 2.4 GHz, it's really not that playable. We lose a lot of performance. You can deduct like 20% of the performance, sometimes even more. Also, if you look at GPU performance, for example, I just died. Okay, never mind. So we will just watch him loot me, and on top left corner you can see GPU is currently at 35 to 40% load, so the GPU is really not that much loaded, and the CPU is constantly between 95 or let's say 80 and 100% overall, so it's completely CPU limited. It's also not memory limited. You can see we're only using 6.1 gigabyte of the 16 gigabyte available, so it's definitely not a memory bottleneck, it's just a CPU bottleneck. And even though the CPU is clocked at 3.25 gigahertz, which is pretty much the maximum I can get stable out of the sample, so it's totally playable even today with 10-year-old hardware, but it's not really nice. And also, I mean, who would pair a Q6600 with a 2080 Ti? Going back to the 30 years ASUS anniversary, we will now do a quick quiz. Basically, you can do the same quiz at your home. I will try to solve it and see how far we can go in the results, and I don't even know how good I will be at a quiz. I will not tell you my answers, but I would be happy to know your results, so let's go over to the quiz. As I mentioned earlier in the video, ASUS is celebrating the 30 years anniversary, and for that purpose ASUS is giving away a lot of very awesome prizes. And for that you should check out the page in the description below, where you can basically just register. You can tell your own very special story about your ASUS product, which is basically what I did in this video, telling about the Rampage Extreme. And there's also a second thing you can do there. You can participate in a special hardware quiz, which will in the end all increase your chance of winning some of the prizes. So if you share your story, if you participate in the quiz, you're increasing your chance of winning prizes, and we will now participate in the quiz. The questions are, for example, basic CPU overclocking requires, or which of the following is true about DDR4 memory, and then it's like a technical question, and you can select different answers. I'm not going to tell you the selection of answers because then you could look it up. So, and they're also taking the time, so I actually have to hurry up. My rank after taking the quiz is 17 out of 113, so it looks like I had one reply wrong. Yeah, correct answer is 9 out of 10. So last one was incorrect. I blame the measurement units for it. If you're also taking the quiz, you will also see which answer I took wrong. And yeah, I wish you all the best of luck. Maybe you can win some of the prizes from the ASUS website. Just participate in the quiz. It's actually quite cool. Good luck to you and see you soon.